All right, so today we're going to talk about the prologue to Invisible Man. Yesterday we looked at the introduction, and even before the story starts proper, we not only have an introduction that Ellison wrote, but there's a prologue. And even between the prologue and the introduction, he places a couple of epigraphs. So we probably need to pay attention to those. I'll be using the 1982 edition, which Ellison wrote the introduction for to commemorate the 30th anniversary of its original publication in 1952. So an epigraph, E-P-I-G-R-A-P-H, is an excerpt from another work that an author will use at the beginning of his work in order to set a tone or to incorporate an idea. Normally, authors, if they have one at all, have one. Ellison has already we can see with both his introduction and a prologue and epigraphs, is not content with just one, but he has two. And so this kind of literary excess that we see he's engaged in really is something that we have to think about and try to figure out, well, what does it say about him, his writing? Does it impact the way we interpret this work? In any event, let's have a look at these epigraphs. The first thing you'll notice is one is by Herman Melville and the other by T.S. Eliot. These are not, these are not nobodies in the literary firmament. These are two very high-end authors. And so here, Ellison is not content to allow his epigraphs to be spoken by a literary nobody, but he actually reaches for the highest shelf of literary luminaries. And what's interesting about the two, not only has he chosen Melville and Eliot, two authors that apparently he wants his work associated with, works that are critically acclaimed and very densely packed with with both literary merit and technical skill. But if you'll notice, when you think about Melville, the first book that comes to mind is Moby Dick, and if you don't choose that one, then maybe the second one might be Bartleby the Scrivener or Billy Budd. Ellison is not content to choose one of those more famous works. He chooses the more obscure work, Benito Cereno, a work that most people haven't read. And so one has to ask oneself, why is Ellison not only choosing an author that is obscure and challenging, but choosing one of the author's least read works? Is it a desire to demonstrate just how steeped he is in literature? Is it a way for him to establish his ethos as a writer? Since this is his first novel, it might be something that he's interested in doing. The theme or the idea in the epigraph from Melville seems to be that despite achieving salvation, one still feels a sense of oppression. So that, as an idea, as a theme that enters his work, is something that also we'll want to keep in mind. The second epigraph from Eliot, once again, is not from The Wasteland or the better-known love song of G. Alfred Prufrock, but instead is from Family Reunion, which is one of Eliot's verse plays. And if you're going to choose one of Eliot's verse plays, you would think you would choose Murder in the Cathedral. But instead of that one, he chooses the lesser-read Family Reunion. And here, the idea of this epigraph seems to be a crisis of an identity or a casting off of identity in the face of some sort of predatory force. So these two ideas, one of this kind of sense of feeling oppressed as one struggles for freedom, and the other also dealing with the idea of evolution or transforming one's identity, still in the presence of some sort of threat, is a consistency between the two that really suggests or should underscore for us the tone that we're supposed to take as we turn the page and encounter the prologue, which we can talk about right now. The prologue itself is rather interesting because we can tell right from the beginning that this is a first-person narration. And the character, who doesn't really name himself, begins speaking in a kind of anachronistic way after the events of the novel have taken place. He alludes to all of these things that have brought him to this subterranean cave that he lives in. And so, in a way, the prologue itself is both orienting and disorienting. We get a chance to hear the narrator, and we get a sense of his attitude, his personality. but we don't get any information or very little information about who he is or what he has been through that has brought him to this position that he is in right now. And so we're struggling to keep up with him. And that idea of struggling to understand your surroundings probably mirrors the various travails or the adventures that the character goes through himself. Obviously, we've already talked about this notion of trying to establish one's own identity. And so here, we're trying to understand what's going on in a way that echoes what the narrator himself must have gone through throughout the course of the book. So what we know from the prologue is that whatever has happened to this narrator, it has driven him underground. And so now he literally lives in a subterranean space that, in an interesting way, he notes a couple of things. One, although he associates himself with Harlem, he recognizes that he exists outside of or just beyond the border of Harlem, which is traditionally known, certainly would have been thought of in the 50s, as an enclave of African Americans living in New York City. So the fact that he is of and yet not of Harlem suggests a kind of disassociation with his surroundings. He feels both a kinship and an alienation simultaneously. And this ambiguity, this ambivalence is something that, with this notion of identity crisis that the author talks about, is something that we've seen even in these first couple of moments with the author. We've seen him return to as a notion over and over again. Somewhat both fantastically or humorously, the narrator tells us that he has illuminated or over-illuminated, and again, that idea of excess, his subterranean space with something like 1,300 or close to 1,400 light bulbs. Obviously, the suggestion here is, at one time we're supposed to be amazed and then maybe also have a difficult time accepting or believing the reliability of our narrator. And whether or not you can trust your narrator is a central preoccupation with literature, especially when you have first-person narrations. How do you know what you're hearing is true, and how do you know when a narrator is so biased by his own perceptions that we really can't trust exactly what he is saying? These are things also that we're going to have to think about. Within the narration, within the short prologue itself, we see, once again, this notion of excess. The narrator not content with a single narrative or a single linear description of his current situation, but it goes from a variety of true events to events that are kind of half remembered, drug-induced, and somehow, again, fictionalized, and within fiction that creates something, again, of a disorientating notion. I want to spend a few minutes walking through this prologue with you, doing a bit of close reading. So forgive me if I look down quite a bit. I'll be noting the page numbers from this edition, so if you're reading, please follow along. Even starting at the first sentence, "I am an invisible man," recalls for us another of Melville's works, Moby Dick, where famously the first sentence is, "Call me Ishmael." So this idea of establishing identity is something that Ellison seems to want his narrator to insist on. And yet paradoxically, and paradox is going to be important as we read not only the prologue but the whole book, paradoxically, in insisting on his identity being recognized, the author's identity is self-annihilating, saying, "I am an invisible man." Or in other words, I have an identity and I don't have an identity simultaneously. And you can't get through the second sentence without, if the first sentence is an allusion to Moby Dick by Herman Melville, the second sentence name drops Edgar Allan Poe. So just as we've seen in the introduction with the profusion of author names that are identified as influences of Ellison, here at the beginning of the narrative itself, we see him unable to let go of this notion of trying to establish his credibility, his ethos. You have to take an author seriously or a narrator seriously if that narrator is well read, right? That adds to his ethos, adds to his credibility. And so this notion of validating his worth is something, obviously, that is important to the narrator. He talks about this notion of invisibility, and is very clear to say he's not literally invisible. He's speaking somewhat metaphorically. And so you have then a narrator who insists on speaking stylistically in figurative language using images and metaphors, and not willing to speak in the simple literal language that many first-person narrators speak in. And so there too, what he seems to be announcing right from the beginning of the story is that this is a book that's going to be very richly textured. So again, as we read it, as we annotate it, this is something that we have to become accustomed to. That the language is going to be very sculpted, very nuanced, and defy immediate or simple understanding. As he proceeds, he talks about this, this crisis of identity that he has. He bumps into a white person on the street who first ignores him and then insults him. And in an insistence that the narrator be recognized, the narrator is reduced to having no other way than assaulting the white individual, and so brutalizes him, all in an effort to make himself recognized, to make himself seen. Ultimately, though, he recognizes the futility of the effort and gives up, and goes immediately from rage to hysterics. And that emotional range, going all the way from a fury to hilarity, it demonstrates again this kind of excess, this notion or this idea that Ellison is not content to speak in a single tone, but instead is interested in occupying the entire field of a human emotional range. And as we move on in the prologue, we see how the narrator is interested in, if he can't make himself recognized, identified, valued, validated by someone else, particularly his majority white culture, then he's going to try to do that himself. If you can't if you can't find yourself appreciated by others, then you're left with no other recourse but to try to find some way to appreciate yourself. And this is something that the narrator does. And I think it's probably worth spending a moment thinking about the narrator as a representative of a type, an archetype, if you will, of the kind of emerging black consciousness or African American consciousness that we see developing through the 30s and 40s, and finally coming into fruition in the 50s and 60s. And so it's in this era, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that Ellison is giving voice to this, to this concept. And so we see him working this out. It's part of Ellison lore, in fact, that this novel that he wrote, this first novel that he wrote, was not the first novel that he intended to write. Not content to just writing critical reviews of jazz and authors, as we talked about in the previous episode, or short stories, he determined that he wanted to write a novel. And his first idea for a novel was to have it set in World War II, since we were just getting out of that period in our history, and the book was going to be set in a prison camp in Germany, where the highest-ranking American prisoner also happened to be a black soldier. And so there was this kind of paradox of African Americans being second class in the United States, but under these certain circumstances, the higher-ranking individual there. And so the idea he was going to work through is how you deal with that kind of paradox. But he says in his writings that while he was planning on writing this book, this novel, this voice of the narrator of Invisible Man kept coming through to him and interrupting his thought, and decided to abandon his novel for what he thought was a truer, more authentic voice of this narrator. And so that novel, although it exists, I think, in kind of like in microcosm in a kind of short story, never got written. But instead we have Invisible Man. And it probably, although it's always worthwhile to question an author's choices, it is probably also fair to say that most of the author's choices are very carefully considered, and so it's probably not fair for us to second guess every one of his choices. And then that's the one I won't. Anyway, we see him dealing with these full range of emotions on the top of page 5, where he goes from the anger to hilarity. And then he talks about his battle with monopolated light and power. Now, obviously, that is meant to be something of a satire of the utilities that have kind of by law a monopoly over the areas that they serve. And so here, the narrator recognizes that there is this force that is overwhelming, and yet he has found a way to subvert it. And so another theme of this book is going to be this idea of subversion, how you exist within a majoritarian culture and not get extinguished by it, how you are able to both triumph and assimilate at the same time. And so that is one of the things that we'll see the narrator working through, this idea as a strategy for survival over and over through the book. Let's see. Moving on, we see some interesting images throughout the whole book. Throughout the whole prologue. There's a very, in addition to the image of all of these lights in his subterranean space, there's also the image that he talks about of, let's see if I can find it, of the vanilla ice cream with the slow gin poured on it, and which he describes as kind of like a red, kind of like obviously a red liquid flowing all over a white surface. And while that literally he's talking about some food that he's prepared for himself, it's hard to overlook the blood of the image that red connotes here. And so in addition to the violence of attacking the white man on the street, there's also these suggestions of violence here. And we see violence also when he has this fantasy of meeting this mom who this slave woman who talks about both loving and hating her husband, or the father of her children, who is also her master, and talks about loving him at the same time that she talks about having poisoned and killed him. Loving him because he gave her her sons, but hating him obviously because of the oppression and the conditions in which she was kept captive. And so these sorts of paradoxes are the sorts of things that we see talked about over and over again. In addition, it's probably worth our while to talk about his reverie that begins on page 9 of the kind of Southern Baptist church with the call and response sort of intonations. While he currently is living in the North, he harkens back to his Southern roots. And so here, in the prologue, it's almost as if he's going to give us in miniature the entire scope of the book itself that covers a geographical range that takes place over the entire eastern part of the United States. And so he gives us a flavor of that in this talk. In this section. And in this section also, we see lots of paradoxes. I said black is and black ain't, and we also see again these intimations of violence when he talks about red and bloody. Similarly, he talks about living within the whale's belly, and that is both an allusion to Jonah and the whale from the Bible, and hearkening back to this notion of the whale from that obviously preoccupies Melville's characters in Moby Dick. And the idea of the whale, or being stuck in the whale's belly, is this idea of being both alive and subsumed or consumed at the same time. And once again, we see paradox and an author trying to find a way to authenticate himself in a culture that, as he says, literally doesn't recognize him, doesn't see him. And so overall, what you're looking at in the in this prologue is an author kind of in a state of stasis. He's been through a lot and is currently, as he suggests, hibernating as a bear might, but suggests by the end of the prologue that his period of hibernation is coming to an end, and that when he does emerge, as a bear would in spring, with all the force and all the pent-up hunger and desire that such a creature would have, he is coming up to the surface. And that suggestion is on one hand self-affirming for him, but ominous and threatening for the culture that has forced him or hunted him and chased him underground. So one of the things that you get from reading the prologue is you get this notion of you get a tone set, you get a chance to meet the character, the narrator, and some themes that are suggested, themes that we're going to see obviously expanded, elaborated on in the course of the novel itself. So for next time, we're going to talk about chapter 1. But before we do that, as long as he talks about Louis Armstrong's "What Did I Do to Feel So Black and Blue," I think it's probably worth our hearing a little bit of that. And so here we go.
Cold empty bed, springs hard as lead, feel like golden dead, wished I was dead. What did I do to be so black and blue? Even the mouse ran from my house. They laugh at you, scorn you too. What did I do to be so black and blue?
All right, I'll see you next time.